Welcome to Who We Are. I'm your host, Maya Kalaria. Decolonising the power of narrative, Who We Are centres the voices of the global majority, people who have experienced colonial harm and marginalisation. Those who may have lost connection to their cultures, lands, ancestral heritage, food, spiritualities, languages, and much more through colonisation, and are now reclaiming their connection to their roots. This is a living archive for stories of struggle, hope, and healing from systems of oppression. It focuses not on what we do, but on who we are, a bridge between the legacy of our ancestors and those who come after us. So let us bear sacred witness to the stories that have silently lived inside our bodies, stories that long to be told and heard. This is who we are. Thank you so much, Paulina, for joining us on Who We Are, the podcast. And I'd love to invite you to start by introducing yourself and sharing a bit more about the lands that you come from and the people that you come from.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Paulina. I am an astrologer specialized in locational astrology. I'm based in California on the Central Coast. My parents are of Cambodian heritage. I'm a first generation Asian American with Cambodian and Chinese roots, living on Chumash land.
Okay, so we're talking about Cambodia today, but you also have some Chinese roots as well. So, where to even begin with this? I wanted to actually start by asking you, were there a lot of cultural stories or myths, family stories, or anything that kind of linked you to your homeland that was passed down to you from your immediate family?
That is a big question. Where to start unpacking? Something that is top of mind for me as an astrologer that works actively with birth dates and times to understand the human experience or the human psyche or the context in which we are living in. Not everyone has the privilege of having access to their birth date and time. And I know this to be true because of the family that I came from. In Cambodia, there is a superstition around certain birth dates. And so it became a normal practice to conceal birth dates of babies being born to protect them from being killed because they believed that certain babies born on certain dates were cursed. And so, in order to protect their children, mothers would say, I don't know when they were born. So, you see a lot of this generation um, that my parents are from. They don't actually know their birth date, they just know their birth year. It's really interesting. Yeah, to have knowledge of your birth date and time is such a privilege. And in the old days, only royalty or super important people, like, in like England or wherever else, only the kings really knew their exact birth date and time because they thought it was like a divine event, right? Royalty coming into the world. And so historians would actually make note of that. And your average person, they didn't know their birth date or time either. But now we live in a world where those things are recorded for most of us, and we do have access to that information. So it's really interesting to look back on that and see it as like such a privilege that we didn't always have access to.
Yeah. And it's such a huge thing. I mean, astrology is one huge aspect of it. And then there's also just having a context within which you exist, like what kind of time of the year you were born, just kind of that, like when you came into this life, and also just practically as well, like filling out forms and the bureaucracy of it all and things like that. So it's like I do wonder if people who did not know their birth dates and times, or if that was deliberately hidden, whether they feel this sense of like anchoring or whether they feel a bit unanchored because of that.
Hmm. Yeah. In a sense, you are denied access to your own history in a way. If you don't know, you know, the story around or the time in which you entered the world. And you can kind of see this reflected as well in stories of adoptees. So, children, you hear this a lot with Korean Americans, especially that were adopted. They don't know their birth information either. You kind of get that story as well with descendants of slavery, not in the same sense of not having access to birth date and time, but having a muddled history, right? Like their ancestral roots, pre slavery, you don't get the privilege of knowing the roots of where you came from. You get access to like the more recent generations. It's like rooted in all this trauma, and that's something that I can relate to. But anything before that, I have no idea.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think actually my grandma on my paternal side, she doesn't have a birth date either. And I think it does this, even though it was for different reasons, because you have mentioned that in Cambodia, you said that if you were born on a certain date or a time, that could be seen as inauspicious and that could cause them to be killed. And so that's pretty serious. That is very, very serious. And when it comes to my family, it was not so serious, but it was more to migrate or to, yeah, I don't know why it was actually, but I think it was to go overseas and to kind of tamper with things so that they could be accepted in certain situations. So it is interesting how that is like a commonality, but in different contexts in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, there is a sense of empowerment that you gain through being able to trace your lineage and understand the story of where you came from, like your podcast, the namesake. But to have the privilege of knowing your lineage for many, many generations back, then you have these rich stories and understanding of sort of the imprint in your DNA that you came into this world with that can help support you through your day-to-day life. And if you don't have that rootedness in that generational knowing or the gifts of your ancestors, it's harder to gain that sense of footing and understand, these are what my gifts are, spiritually, emotionally, intuitively, because you can kind of trace that back, right? For people that have the privilege of knowing their families for generations and generations, they're like, oh, this is a gift within my family, and that gets passed down. I know we tend to think of it as like genetic and DNA, but I think there's also this energetic spiritual quality to it as well that we can't really quantify with science yet.
Yeah. And because you speak so eloquently about that, am I right in thinking that this is your experience too, that there may have been this fragmentation in knowing that for you, for yourself? Or, was any information like that passed down to you?
Yeah, fragmentation is a great word. I've been able to collect little bits and pieces, and because there's also a language and cultural barrier between myself and my parents, because born in the States, raised in the States, and literal translations of words, between their mother tongue versus my first language is English. There are just certain things that get mistranslated, so it's hard to know. So, um, since 2016, I would say, um, I made a conscious choice to think more deeply and look into where I came from. So that included a trip a solo trip to Cambodia to kind of see where my parents came from and understand the context, and that put me into a little bit of an identity crisis. Because even though I'm here in this motherland, because I wasn't born there, I wasn't accepted as, one of them. It's like, actually, you're an American. Meanwhile, my experience as an American in the United States, as a person of color, it's like, well, you're not one of us because you don't look like a person that belongs to the dominant culture. So then I'm in this place where I'm like, well, I went back to where I came from, and they told me I don't belong there. And then going back to where I was born, the messaging, the underlying message is also, you don't belong here. So it's like, well, then where do I belong? This is an interesting beginning of understanding who I am and where I do belong, um, which was, painful but powerful at the same time. And as an astrologer practicing locational astrology, I could see this experience directly reflected on my astrocartography map. I have a Chiron MC line, Chiron midheaven line, running through Southeast Asia with the zenith point. So that's where the planetary body is directly overhead on the astrocartography map. The Chiron zenith point is in Cambodia, right next to the village that my mother grew up in. And that's when I knew that astrocartography was real, because Chiron represents the wounded healer, and the midheaven represents, your public reputation or how you are received in the world. And here I was in this area of the world, realizing this like wound of a lack of acceptance by the greater world. Um, at that point in my life, I was sort of like, well, where do I belong if I don't belong in the motherland? And I also don't feel like I belong in the place from, where I was born. So it was a really interesting crossroads for me. And it also forced me to confront my privilege, because there is a lot of privilege in being born in a Western country, to have a passport from the United States, which allows me to go, to all these countries, um, and realize, even though there are struggles with being a person of color in a country like the United States, there's still a lot of privilege inherent in being an American citizen. And it made me realize, like, I have access to education, higher education as a woman. If I was in Cambodia instead, I don't think I would have the same access to learning, and I may not have the same opportunities to travel or expand my worldview in the same way. And so it was a bit of a reckoning. It was painful, but also empowering at the same time.
Mm. Yeah. And I think what makes it more complex is America's involvement in why Cambodia is in, I never say developed or underdeveloped, I say recovering. It's recovering.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
Debatable.
Because it was,
It's always something.
yeah, yeah. And it was so kind of used. That land was used by many different external forces, America being one of them. I believe Vietnam and France as well. And
Mm,
so there's all these different, and Thailand as well. So like Cambodia, like India, would have been a much richer country if it wasn't for all the chaos that caused this kind of
mhm,
devolution, I guess, similar to, many of our motherlands. And so, like, the privilege of living on American land, it's like I feel similarly, because I live in English soil, but England categorically and historically denigrated India. And so there's this kind of like complex relationship, and we are super privileged, and at the same time, there's also fragmentation that those that live on the motherland
mhm.
do not probably experience in the same way that we do, where there's such a loss of language and culture. And even, I wanted to ask you, just kind of the direct history of your parents, do they talk much about the traumatic experiences that they went through?
Yeah, not so much my father. He's definitely a man of very few words. But for my mother, it was something that she's shared with me from a very early age before I would even have the capacity to really fully understand some of those things. But it's very much shaped my relationship with her. She lost her mother in a concentration camp, so in a working camp. So this was, as a result of the now recognized as a genocide as of 2018, many decades later after the fact. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of traumatic experiences that my parents went through. And I think because of the cultural stigma, especially in the Asian American community and the Asian diaspora as a whole, of viewing receiving mental health help as something to be shameful about, the Cambodian American community has been deeply underserved in that regard, and a lot of that generation prefer to sweep it under the rug and move forward as if, it never happened. And so there's all this unaddressed pain and loss and grief and trauma that informs how they show up in their day to day, and then that in turn impacts the way that they've raised their children or their grandchildren. Um, and it has this, quiet, pervasive, rippling effect in our day-to-day lives. And so, even though I did not experience it firsthand, I experience it downstream. Um, and it still has a big impact. And that is something that is hard to explain, right? Because on the surface, like I'm a Californian, I'm an American citizen. How privileged, how lucky. But, underneath all that's like, well, there's all this backstory as well. And we can't just dismiss that. And so for me, part of my healing journey has been confronting this storyline that I've inherited, and making sense of it. But contextualizing it has helped me have more compassion for myself and my own journey and how I show up in my day to day life because it's not an easy background to come from. And I'm sure a lot of other people can relate to that too with the stories in their lineages. But I think recognizing the pain that is there is empowering versus hiding under a rock or sweeping it under the rug or pretending like it did not affect us whatsoever. Um, I think that these painful experiences or painful memories are opportunities to transmute our emotions into something that could have a positive impact. And if we don't transmute that pain, it metastasizes into something else.
Mm. Absolutely. I could not agree more with you. And I also understand, although I come from a different background, this witnessing the ones you love in the generations before you, having signs of this trauma manifest through them on a day to day basis, and perhaps not always understanding or having the conscious awareness to know that that's manifesting in that way, or even if they do, not having the access to mental health services or the kind of I guess it does take courage as well to access it, but also it takes accessibility, right? Like you said, the Cambodian American community is underserved. It that means it's not recognized enough as well, and not given the
Hmm.
importance that it deserves. Especially because America was part of the problem. And so, when did you start to realize that some of the ways in which, like, say, your parents were behaving, or some of the ways that they were showing up day to day, was actually related to what they went through? Or was it something that you always understood? Like you just knew that they'd gone through something difficult and they were struggling?
I think it's sort of tied into my own personal healing journey, because I'm like, well, you know, I am the way I am because of the accumulation of my life experiences, and how I view the world is deeply shaped by the people that raised me, right? And so a little bit after this trip to Cambodia, and I had this identity crisis, but also an epiphany of how privileged I am despite all the ways that I do feel oppressed. um, I was like, well, I have the privilege to go back to school and complete my studies. So I completed studies in anthropology, including medical anthropology, and Asian American studies, and that informed a lot for me about the context in which I came from. I needed to understand why I was showing up in the world the way that I was, and I knew, you can only put out so much personal individual effort. A lot of how your life is shaped are due to circumstances beyond your control that happened long before you were ever born, right? Because we're born into a society, we're born into a culture, we're born into certain environments, and you don't get a choice in that. It's just what happens. And so I was like, I need to understand why. So, going to school, studying this, understanding transgenerational trauma through the lens of medical anthropology helped me. And also looking at Asian American history as well. And the aggregation of Asian American statistics is another thing, right? Because the Asian diaspora is very, very diverse. But if you're in the United States and you're Asian, you all get grouped into one conglomerate statistic. But the disparity between those who are doing really well, like on all these traditional markers of success, versus those who are not, if you actually disaggregate the data, you'll see that those who are of Eastern Asian descent are doing really, really well. But if you are from Southeast Asia, like including the Hmong communities or Cambodian communities, you're doing worse off than the average American, like far, far worse. So it's really interesting. But then when you're grouping all these people together and very, very diverse groups of people together, then those that aren't doing well aren't going to receive the help that they need because everyone's focused on, the data is skewed by those that are doing extremely well. And they're doing even better than your average person that you would, yeah, doing better than those you typically view as extremely privileged in this society. I feel like I went down a tangent. I don't know what the question was anymore.
You know what, though? It's really interesting to hear this. And it does lead back into the question, really, because it's about discovering the context in which certain behaviors or kind of ways of being that were directly impacted by trauma, like how that came to be, and you had to understand, like, why are you experiencing certain things? Why is this happening? And so, like, yeah, you went down that route to find out, and then it would have given you a better understanding of your parents and your ancestors as well, I'm guessing, through that.
Yeah. So learning the statistic that, Asian Americans are the least likely to seek out help for mental health issues. I'm like, oh yeah, that tracks. But it's, a combination of things, right? A combination of factors that um, synergize together and then create these conditions. And although this story is deeply personal to me, what it has helped me achieve is to not take it so personally that this has been my path, right? So rather than feeling like a victim of what my family's history has been or what my roots are, it's more like now that I have that information and that knowledge, I can feel empowered to say, hey, that is true. But also, here's why. And I don't have to blame myself for it. And I also don't have to blame my parents for it either because they did their best with what they were given. Even if sometimes I think their best sucks. Um, but like you could say that about anyone, and I think having that realization allowed me to find more compassion for myself, more compassion for my parents, and also just more compassion for people in general, like even people that are pissing me off. So I feel like this journey of self-understanding and self-love has opened me up to understand other people and love other people more easily as well. But it's like this, turning inward and going deeply into myself in order to show up in the way that I want to and understand others more clearly.
Yeah. The inner work is so important, isn't it? It really is.
Hmm.
And it's lovely to hear you talk about it because it's not something that everyone either has access to knowing how to do or even wants to do. So it's lovely to hear that, and I'm also a huge advocate and fan of the inner work, and it takes up most of my time. So, and I've seen the fruit of it, and it sounds like there's been so much fruit that has been, born from your journey. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've mentioned that you went back to Cambodia and it had its complexities, but what are the other ways in which you have reclaimed or tried to reclaim your roots to your Cambodian heritage?
Yeah, I think, when I was around 6 or 7, we moved from the city into the suburbs. So in California, I was living in Los Angeles when I was born, very multicultural. And we moved to this more agricultural area where demographically it's like 80% Caucasian. So, don't really see a whole lot of people of color around me. And along with that included, xenophobic and racist attitudes. And because of the way that the media was throughout my childhood, too, you receive a lot of messaging about what is deemed as beautiful or worthy. And so that cultivated a sense of self-hatred within me throughout my childhood. And yeah, I think part of my healing journey is undoing that. And I've been actively undoing that. And, I remember thinking, like, praying at night that I'd wake up blonde hair and blue eyed so that the kids on the playground would play with me. But now that I'm older, it's kind of like, well, I'm glad that I come from such a diverse and unique and interesting background, and I get to share this story and live this story of triumph despite the pain and despite the horror, to create beauty regardless of what the struggles have been. And also reclaiming pride over being Asian. Um, that has been something that is recent within the last, like, probably 4 or 5 years for me, like having pride in my heritage, um, because it's not an easy story to carry. And to thrive despite what has been is something that I think is worth celebrating.
Yeah, it definitely is worth celebrating, and it's not an easy story to carry, and it is a particularly traumatic story that Cambodia has, and it's one of those things where if we don't alchemize it somehow, there's nowhere to put that story down or to transform it into something because it's just living inside the body.
Hmm.
And so I think it's really important your perspective and how you've worked through that and been able to make sense of something that in many ways was senseless. That there was so much violence and trauma caused. And so like running that through the body and kind of processing that is I find for many of us like it takes some time, and where that journey kind of even when you think it ends, there's something else that sometimes comes along and it's like, oh, that's something else. So it's just it is, for those of us who've moved and who or have been born in a different country, it's something that we carry with us, and we don't always feel like we belong in the motherland or where we are. So um, do you have other people in your life who are part of the Cambodian community who you can talk to about, you know, well, anything that comes up for you?
Not really, to be quite honest, because I grew up so removed from Southern California and um, the largest population of the Cambodian American diaspora is actually concentrated in Long Beach, California. And I grew up on the Central Coast, which is about 300, 400 miles north. Um, I felt really isolated from other people that looked like me or that could have had, been raised in a similar family background. So yeah, it has been a very deeply insular journey for myself, but I think something that's really helped me um, learn how to vocalize these things is a combination of getting super deep into a yoga practice and opening up my hips. I spent the first few years crying like every class. And then going to therapy as well has helped a lot. Just having this safe space to ventilate and air out some of those things. And also a lot of journaling, I think, too, has been really helpful. Um, yeah, I can't say that I'm aware of any community or organization that does like deep restorative work in that regard. And I don't know, I'm not sure what that would look like either for the Cambodian American community because there is a very strong attitude of like, there's nothing wrong with me, and brush it under the rug. And so it kind of makes me feel like I'm the crazy one. Maybe I am the crazy one, but I feel a lot happier and lighter, and I'm not pretending like there's nothing wrong. So,
You're not the crazy one, definitely not. It's very sane. It's very sane to be acknowledging that there is something that has been wrong, and that you don't have to just sweep it under the carpet all the time. And I wanted to ask, sadly, there isn't anything that springs to mind that provides this sort of safe space for Cambodian Americans or just Cambodians who, wherever they live, who have experienced this. But what would you like to see if you were to receive support? If there was like some sort of community, what would you think would help you?
hmm, that's a really good question. I've never really thought about that. Something that I think about a lot though is performative allyship. Um, Especially being here in San Luis Obispo, California, where I feel like there is a lot of performative allyship and thinking about the history of like, Japanese internment here during World War II and the destruction of Chinatowns. And funny enough, here, their version of, um, you know, justice, they had built a parking lot over, one of the lots where they had destroyed a Chinatown. And to, honor that portion of history, what they did was slap a Chinatown neon light on the parking lot building. And I'm like, okay, that's you guys wanted to applaud yourselves for doing something. But what does that actually do? I think reparative justice and restorative justice would be, you know, financing or funding Asian American businesses. That would have been a great way to, honor the history and make things right versus slapping a sign on a parking lot and saying, hey, this is our Chinatown. Um, it just seems really like I want a participations trophy for recognizing that this is Chinatown and now there's a parking lot, so now we're going to put a sign. But that money could have been allocated to actually supporting Asian Americans who were impacted by that storyline.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's like different aspects of what would be needed. So financial justice, financial support, and then I'm guessing as well like the emotional support, and a holding space, right, for those who were affected. And yeah, it I still, from listening to you, I think that there still needs to be quite a lot of support, for this community, that it doesn't sound like it's been given yet to the level that it needs to be. And I mean, I wonder if any listeners are like tuning in and know of any. So feel free to contact me and I can pass those details on to Paulina and anyone else who needs them. But it does sound like people are left to just deal with things. And as long as the history and the past is not recognized and the damage that's been done, it's like people just turn a blind eye and just carry on, and it's people are suffering. So I really applaud you for like working through that in an isolated way, because that's all you had access to as well, because there hasn't been enough like external support, and you've still done it. You've still had the motivation to work through those things which are really painful, and not everyone does that. And so I wanted to end by asking you a similar question, but not quite. Um, Thinking about our descendants, whether it's our children or whether it's just those who come after us, who are part of our community, who are part of the global majority, what kind of world would you like to help create for them?
Yeah, I think the world that I would like to see is one where, everyone has their basic needs met, and a clean home environment, the land, being properly taken care of because the land takes care of us. And so I like to see more respect in that synergistic relationship. Yeah, a restored earth, I think, would be my ideal for descendants, but we will see. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. And also, the listeners don't know this, but we had a lot of tech issues before the podcast, and Paulina was very, very patient with that whole thing. And it is Mercury retrograde. So many could say I'm foolish for trying to do this during that time. However, I see it as a time of revisitation and reclamation as well. So it feels like I think this is a good time. But thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wisdom and your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's interesting that you shouted that out because transiting Mercury retrograde is actually on my Chiron right now. So this feels very poignant and on the nose. I'm actually verbalizing my pain and sharing it. So this has been very therapeutic. Thank you so much, Maya.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. And thank you.